A very good evening on this wonderful Sunday evening. It's the 10th day of July 2016. Welcome to this edition of the Fourth Estate, your ultimate weekend ender political talk show that gives a bit of analysis, gives some bit of prescription, and possibly digs deeper into the issues that have made it to the news in the week that we are closing, or those of you who follow the other calendar, the week that we are starting. My name is Simon Kasiate. I'm standing in for the regular host of this program, Charles Mwangukiampaji, who unfortunately is unable to be with you this evening, and I hope that I'll try to fit in the size of his shoes and possibly walk with the shine that comes with it. This evening, I'm joined by the regulars on this program, except for one. Ivan Okuda, a journalist with the Daily Monitor and a student of law at Machar University. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. Oh, sorry.
End up
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, Uganda.
Well, you can call me Charlie. I think it's a nice name. And the other regular member sitting at the opposite end of the arrangement, Mr. Onapito Ekomoloi, Director for Communications or Director for Corporate Affairs at SAB Mila, now transformed into something else. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Nile Breweries.
Nile Breweries.
Good evening, Simon, and nice to see you.
Well, great. At least I'm glad you haven't called me Charlie.
A partner in crime from the corporate world.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. We're not anymore now. I have switched back to government, Mr. Onapito Ekomoloi. So I am glad to work.
That's very sad to hear.
I thought it should be a happy thing. Why not? We'll discuss the details later. Morrison Wakakamba, still smelling some jet fuel, having arrived just the other day from Harvard University, where you had gone for a long sojourn, getting yourself intellectually more motivated and polished, if I may. You are still the Special Assistant to the President of the Republic of Uganda, in charge of information and research. Good evening, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Simon. I think I came back with more questions and quite humbled.
Now you're sounding more like the other Ugandans that have been in the US for a very long time. Yeah. You're exceedingly what?
I said humbled.
Well, I know they always put an adjective to it. Okay. This evening, viewers, we have an array of conversation topics to share with you, and of course among just ourselves. But also most pertinent is that even as we begin this conversation today, we are in a volatile region that our, should I say, little or small brothers, South Sudan, seems to be going back to where we thought they had moved away from. You've heard of reports coming in from South Sudan of fighting between the usual factions of Salva, Kiir, who is president, and Riek, Machar, who is vice president. We had these skirmishes many months ago. Uganda sent boots on the ground. Noise was made as to why we were in there. And after we returned, facilitated a peace process, and everything seemed to be normal, and they are back at it again. And so I think for a moment, we may need to reflect and ask ourselves some questions on whether our presence in South Sudan could possibly have averted this if we were still there. Nonetheless, the death toll as at least of Friday, we are talking about in excess of 250 people. As of today, close of Sunday, the situation can only be described as getting worse. And that will be the first conversation topic that we'll have this evening. And I'll start with you, Onapito. You have a bit of background about this issue, having worked as a journalist at the time South Sudan was not in existence, but of course the conflict in Sudan, pitting South Sudan people as we know them today and the Khartoum people, as it were, was raging on. You followed these events up to where we are today. As an opening remark, what do you make of the skirmishes we are facing in South Sudan, at least over this weekend?
Simon, this is one of the saddest stories about the black race, in my view. And it actually makes a mockery of the current struggles of the black people in the United States when they have this banner that Black Lives Matter. Really, how would anybody who is not black really think Black Lives Matter if in the homeland of black people, black lives don't matter? That's what we are seeing in South Sudan, at the hands of their own fellow black people. Because to me, when the rest of black Africa got independence so many decades ago, we could say we hadn't seen enough. So there was room for making mistakes, there was a lot to learn. But over 50 years down the road, South Sudan is supposed to have seen all the lessons, all the mistakes of the rest of black Africa. And when they got independence, we thought they would not repeat the mistakes of other independent African countries, whose independence was always followed by conflict, But when you see that we just, in the 21st century, we are incapable of managing ourselves, it is just a sad story to me, that is. And in fact, it really makes, to repeat, it makes a mockery of that slogan that Black Lives Matter.
Honor Peter Ekom right there with his 2 pence in description of what he makes of the bloodbath that we currently are observing in South Sudan. Well, I'll come to you, Morrison, later. Sorry, I have to jump you all the time because you're not a regular here, and so a bit of bullying does take place, I'm informed. So, Ivan, from where you sit as a journalist covering this story, of course, this provides a great fodder for you in the media. This is something that we're going to talk about for a long time. We're going to go deep into the issues, get the story behind the story. But away from the excitement of being at the front seat of history as it's made as a journalist, do you share the same thoughts that, in fact, what we are seeing in South Sudan, the bloodbath, is a vindication of the fact that, indeed, many of us sloganeer Black Lives Matter, but we don't practice what should propagate it?
Of course, first, utmost sympathies with families in Southern Sudan caught in the labyrinth of a conflict they just have no idea about. Because ultimately, the person that is at the receiving end of the misery that comes with war is a person who is not at the decision-making table. And for me, that is evidence of the cost of politics that is not sorted. Because at the heart of this is Salva Kiir on one side and Riek Machar on the other. And it takes 2 men to sit and have a solution to this long-ranging conflict. I was reading an article that was penned by Salva Kiir and Riek Machar in the New York Times.
Absolutely.
Which the New York Times has had to make a clarification on, saying Riek Machar actually contacted, through a proxy, the New York Times to state that he did not contribute to that essay. And the New York Times goes ahead to clarify that Salva Kiir's spokesman contacted us again and confirmed Riek Machar did contribute to this opinion in the New York Times. But the crux of that essay in the New York Times is a call to the international community for a discussion around peace and reconciliation in Southern Sudan. Because the argument that Salva Kiir makes, now that Riek Machar has distanced himself from the article, is that one of the solutions in the peace pact is a hybrid court for Southern Sudan, supervised by the international community, applying international law. And that, according to Salva Kiir, was bound to cause anarchy, because the people that are feeling that are apprehensive about this international justice system that will essentially put them in the gallows. And the solution to that is to follow what happened in Northern Ireland and South Africa. The
Truth and Reconciliation
Commission.
Commission.
Exactly. And if that fails, then you're going to have anarchy. So as if that was the precursor to what we see.
So they narrow down their options of having a peaceful resolution to whatever skeletons are languishing away, you know that. And you bring in a very interesting aspect where what should have been a mutually agreed upon article by 2 men at the center of all this, one backs out or at least claims that they were not party to it. And we draw parallels from the next conversation we'll be having, that political conversation between the opposition and the government of Uganda, and how one of the opposition parties is making claim to the fact that they were not party to the other opposition groups, and whatever they said with President Museveni is said in their own right without their consultation. And yet we also know that their Secretary General was a party to that. A long story around that, but we'll get to the details of that when we come to that subject. Morrison, you've been following international events very closely, and of course, with now the new academic hat that you wear on your head, you possibly will look at things in perhaps a different perspective. But what do you make of this situation in South Sudan, especially after we have, of all that Africa, and even very specifically Uganda, has had to go through in the last decade in an attempt to pacify the place and their independence, and go further to ensure that there is peaceful coexistence between the little minute tribes that make the bulk of the people there?
I think what we see in South Sudan is really a leadership crisis. And at the helm of that leadership crisis, are the very leaders, contesting, and the protagonists, this Salva Kiir, and of course Machar. I do believe they never engaged in very serious adaptive work of creating institutions, of mobilizing their own people, and think that external forces, from wherever they come from, are going to resolve these internal contradictions of state building and rebuilding peace. Is most of the time really a facade. I agree with some of the arguments that say, yes, international actors can guarantee what happens in South Sudan. South Sudan, born in 2011, being part of, the member of the African Union, we are working very quickly to get it within the East African community. And when peace prevails in South Sudan, there are spillover benefits for all the countries around the region. So certainly Uganda, Kenya, and any other country around the world, has a stake in peace in South Sudan. But essentially, the real sustainable peace must be, first of all, a contest within the political forces within, to make sure that it is resolved, to make sure that it is not because I was meeting some members of parliament from South Sudan, and what they were saying is that actually real Sudanese people, South Sudanese people, don't know what's going on. They call it an ego of two men, and they have a feeling. The real people, save for the military, where you have command and control, and people follow up. But the real people, the moms and the teachers and the women and the farmers and the private sector, they just wake up and then there are gunshots, and then they are cool. They read in the newspapers and they are running for their life. So there is no conversation, adaptive conversation
down to
of
the
people who
citizens.
they don't know the issues. What are we fighting for? What is Machar, Machar and the Salva Kiir fighting for?
Aren't you over academicizing it, if I may use that term? I mean, the issues are known. I am this tribe, he's the other tribe, and my tribe should be dominant, and that's what it is.
And I wish those were issues. Because, because they are essentially not. Because when you look at the public speeches that they make, nobody's saying that, I'm fighting because the Nuer or the Dinka are the ones that are supposed to be in power. What you see is actually somebody who feels perhaps it is my turn, perhaps you're running this country not in a very good way, the inflation is off the hook, you're controlling all the oil, you're running a corrupt government. They have been together. So there is no clarity, really, on why. I mean, because when we had wars here, they were essentially largely ideological. Do you see? But in South Sudan,
I want to bring in my usual age of
you don't see
until the lion learns how to ride.
You don't
Every
see
story about hunting will glorify the hunter.
No, you don't see an ideological. You don't see an ideological contestation.
Well, you're very right. And Onapito did. You called it a leadership crisis.
Yes.
Onapito called it a travesty of Black Lives Matter. Ivan did put his peppered in this whole thing talking about international justice and all that.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on the Black Lives, because I really do think that Black Lives matter and every life anyway.
No one disagrees.
Nobody
with
disagrees, but it's
Anyway,
a mockery of
it's
the
how-
statement.
It's how
But I wanted
travesty is in how we act towards that. But
and I just wanted to add one thing.
Yes.
That if we compare Africa and Europe and the West America and all those places, I think they have lost more people in state building wars, from world wars, from the French Revolution, that I think if we killed ourselves even 50 times more, we are not going to reach that extent.
But why I disagree with that?
That's certainly not an excuse.
Morrison, we killed ourselves here in tribal wars
But that's
between
not-
Banyora and Bagana. And
Maybe there are no records, but that's not an
perhaps.
excuse. But that's not an excuse anyway for what we see as bigotry.
Without a
and-
doubt.
and-
Now,
and-
let's bring it down to the two men whose egos now, at least it's very clear, either they just want to sit on the same table and have constructive discussions on how they want to carry their countries forward. And let's just dissect who they are. I mean, this is something that we've talked about for donkeys years, but I think it's important to get down to the bottom of it. I mean, Ona, when you look at the man in Salva Kiir and the man in Riek Machar, are these serious people that the people of South Sudan ought to surely entrust with the future of their livelihood, their survival, and their sheer existence? Isn't it just about time?
Well,
These people start looking at other alternatives?
Simon, I think we always remain reminded that we get the leaders we deserve. So I guess you can't say that they are not the people of South Sudan deserve. Of course, in the context of their struggle against the Arab Sudan, they were at the center of it with the late John Garang. So they have the historical credentials to lead their people. But I think now to me, the basic problem is that they are trapped in a struggle for, it's not even really power, it's more about resources. A lot of stories have been told about how money is shared in South Sudan right at the airport when they have forex. It doesn't even reach the banks. So, I mean, so clearly there is no control in terms of how to share the national resources. And I think that should be one of their biggest challenges. And I believe since Machar arrived in Khartoum, that is really must be the contention, how to share the treasury, how to share whatever little money they have. And until when you have the capacity to agree on how to share, ultimately it's going to be down to that.
And that brings me to the question. So it's not even about the people of South Sudan, it's about resources.
Unfortunately, it's not about the people.
Maybe
it's
not about the people.
But just before Morrison comes in, I think to me also the international community has played a lot of hypocrisy in terms of South Sudan. Remember, South Sudan, much as they fought as a people against Arab domination, the independence of South Sudan was more of an international project. Uganda and a lot of other countries put together a lot of pressure to negotiate, first of all, the peace between Khartoum and SPLA, and then ultimately South Sudan independence was really a negotiated project. But the world has pretended that they don't see the inability of the leaders in South Sudan to manage themselves and manage their people. We purport that these are independent, sovereign, but clearly they are not independent in their ability to make decisions for their people.
Well, you've put it very diplomatically, but I think bottom line, you are simply saying that the two men really have no locus.
Look, I've actually said, and I know people think this is not conventional thinking, that South Sudan is a perfect case for an international administration. If you actually care about the people, get these rogues out of the way and help the people to be on their feet.
It brings up a very interesting conversation, but before we can tag on to that one, Morrison, and before we go in for a break, because time is certainly not on our side, Honor does make mention of, he brings it down to the issue of sharing resources to such a level that we look at money being split between two people and two factions, so to speak. That brings in the element of the absence of a proper governance structure. A strong man that comes to say, look, whereas we're in all this together, but these will be the rules by which this game will be played. Do you get the sense that, in fact, even with Salva Kiir as president and Riek Machar as deputy, there's been no presence of a governance structure that should lead this country to somewhere where one can say, well, there's some governance going on?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And perhaps to add to that point is that perhaps unlike the NRA, NRM, or unlike RPF in Rwanda and some of these places, actually Salva Kiir they didn't really inherit a very robust civil service, a very robust public service. Because recently I was in President's office and some other places, and there are people there who used to work in the administration of Milton Obote, who is in the Minister of Finance, and there are people who in ranks and now who are, chiefs of treasury and all that, but they are part of even, the system that existed before. So I think Salva Kiir and his administration was not lucky. So the level, the capacity of institutions, it's Ugandan consultants, who are, and Kenyan consultants and Ethiopian consultants who actually helped to run South Sudan and create some, patchwork of civil service. So you're talking about institutions. It's a very, 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 huge problem. But even then the second aspect from the governance structure that you mentioned is I think that Mayardit Salva Kiir was not broad-based and really clever enough to know that the best shooters from the bush are not the best, administrators. Yeah, because I think in some other countries, there were some of those guys who were, hardcore, during the Bush War. But when, the government came on board, it was like, who are these educated guys? Who are the people who have the experience? How can we get in people like, whether it is Samuel Gere, whether it's Pichoza Kazibu and others who could have been in DP and other places.
The South Sudanese, Morrison, we've got millions of South Sudanese in the diaspora who are working in international corporate organizations, some even working in governments across the world where they have earned their citizenship, and they have got incredible skills in governance structures from a corporate and public sector.
I think
these ought to come back home and can only come home when they have the assurance of a strong man, so to speak, that he is willing to allow them to come and do their job. And Salva Kiir lacks that.
We don't disagree, because the point I'm making is that South Sudan has this human resources and capacity all over the world, but the leadership was not willing to say, wait a minute, I think we need these guys to come and help. So he never did that, which I think is a
Ivan,
problem.
so to tag on to that, it's clear, therefore, that in all this, there seems to be a central, or what we call in physics, a fulcrum, a pivot where everything else tends to revolve, you know, the anchor. In other places where some bit of progress has taken, and he gives an example of the NRM and for obvious reasons, he also gives the example of RPF. I mean, you're talking about leaders who are able to marshal the troops and be on top of their game and say, look, I am President Kagame and everything will work this way. He's a reference point. Salva Kiir doesn't seem to strike that kind of image of a person that is really in charge.
People who know Salva Kiir will tell you he's one hell of...
Not a heaven?
he's one hell of a... possibly, not exactly an incompetent guy, but a guy without a backbone. Even in terms of leadership, people who have met him think he's just not cut for the job. But I think the issue goes beyond the competence of the civil service or lack thereof of it, or Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. There are real serious issues, which I think the international community did not address when we're drafting the peace accord. Because, again, to refer to that New York Times essay by Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, the history of the peace accord essentially set the stage for an accident going to happen anytime soon. And it's happened. Because, first, the agreement is arrived at literally on gunpoint. Salva Kiir is facing an arms embargo. The international sanctions that the UN is screaming at, the US is shouting from New York and Washington. Britain, on the other side, is issuing a number of threats. So Salva Kiir had no option but to append his signature on that agreement after about 7 other such agreements failed. So by the time, even Riek Machar also had fundamental disagreements with the agreement. So I think at the level of trying to forge cohesion, we failed as the international community from step one.
And you bring in a very interesting perspective, which we'll lash on when we come back from this break. The intervention of the international community, and very specifically Uganda. When Uganda went in there, the time troops went as far as you know where, at least if for nothing else, to stop the bloodbath. Then, of course, we had all these voices internally, which were saying, there he goes again, President Museveni, with his imperialistic adventures, going across the region and trying to assert himself militarily. He went in there, came back, facilitated the peace process together with others. Now see where we've ended. Is the situation as it is today, and this question will answer when we return from the break, is the situation as it is today a vindication of our initial activity to go in there and pacify this place and assert ourselves over them and marshal them into a peaceful corner? Or is it, in fact, a vote of no confidence? Say, look, you went in there, you spent money, you trained our boys and ladies that wear uniform, and now see, we're back at one. It's the fourth estate, a conversation that continues to rage on here. We're discussing the situation in South Sudan, the bloodbath, as has been reported by various media, and of course, that includes interventions coming in from the international community that are now busy issuing travel advisories. Canada has advised its citizens to stay indoors and wait for that clarion call to flee at the nearest. And non-government organizations which have found that place to be fodder for their activities are also warning their staff to watch out for any suspicious activity, but keep their heads down low, and many other things that you don't want to hear coming in from South Sudan. When we return from this break, it's a conversation taking another twist on the international community's intervention in there. Welcome back to this edition of the Fourth Estate. My name is Simon Kasiat, and well, coming in from that break with the 3 incredible gentlemen with whom we're having this discussion, Onapito Ekomoloit, Morrison Rakakamba, and Ivan Okuda, is the subject of South Sudan and the reports of a bloodbath in that country as a result of the failure to appreciate the little semblance of peace that had been put in place, where the Salva Kiir group and that of Riek Machar don't seem to want to appear to work together for the good of that country. When all hell broke loose many months ago, Uganda went in, tried to create a buffer zone, if for nothing else, just to stop the senseless killings of especially civilians. We had noise coming in from internal places here saying, why should Uganda get involved in the South Sudan? And the argument then was that South Sudan sneezes, we catch a cold in Uganda. Obviously because we ought to live in a neighborhood that we can, ably, rely on for commerce and other things. But also importantly, you don't have an influx of refugees coming into Uganda. And the debate raged on. But what's your view? Should Uganda have actually stayed there to date? And if so, would we be where we are today? I'm asking you, Morrison.
Okay, I just wanted you to be clear. Yeah, I mean, first of all, you realize that South Sudan is an independent state, and it has
so-called independent
and
state.
it has it has relations. It is a party to international related statutes. It's a member of IGAD. And the peace and the accords that were negotiated and signed, there were so many guarantees, and definitely Uganda had responsibilities, and there was an agreed time, for it to be out. So it's not just about Uganda's decision to say we want to stay for 1 year, we want to stay for 2 years. So it's a matrix. It's the dynamic includes other number of guarantors. But you are right that the participation of Uganda, first of all, stopped the genocide, stopped the bloodbath, and led to evacuation. First of all, not only the citizens of Uganda, but other global citizens. So the role of Uganda and other actors really saved lives. But to really cap this point is to say that accords and what Onapito calls international. You said that South Sudan was fixed by the international community and it's not on its own. I really want to agree that all these accords, activities of the international community are essentially technical fixes, and the technical fix really cannot survive. The adaptive work of the politics and getting people together to decide on a common purpose and how they want to take the country forward lies on the South Sudanese. It is Machar, it is Salva Kiir, it is the people of South Sudan to sustainably urge out their case, find out to manage their country, or other actors can play supportive role, resuscitate the situation now like there is a bloodbath. It is legitimate that guarantors of the peace accords within the region go there and stop that, but invest, whether you're international community or neighbors, because our peace depends on their peace. We must invest in adaptive work of mobilizing South Sudanese, invest in social services, and hold to make sure that those guys, people of South Sudan, can hold their country. And
I just want to put a very specific question to you, Morrison.
Yeah.
Should we tomorrow, for example, send our boys with boosters, especially for nothing else, to pacify Juba airport, at least to allow for folks to leave the country?
From a Pan-African perspective and other factors, I think it would be uncouth for us to sit back and see millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people perish if we have capability to intervene and save lives. At the end of the day, for now, the short-term focus should be how do we help save lives.
Ivan, you're a guy that has a bit of knowledge on matters of law and all that. In whatever is taking place in South Sudan, there must be a point where people take responsibility. And taking responsibility for these actions ought to be under the grander ambit of an international justice system. The International Criminal Court comes to mind when you talk about that. These men, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, from your look at it from a law perspective, how about if we swung the prospect of an indictment to them? Because I think between them, they are largely responsible for crimes against humanity, crimes of war, and everything that should be working. I think they need to be shown a point of responsibility for them at least to restrain themselves. How about that?
Absolutely, because in the first leg of the discussion, what came up was the mention of the word strongman. You cannot have a strongman in Southern Sudan now. Neither Machar nor Kiir can be that person. So the strongman in this case can only be an international actor. The international actor can only afford to, to crack the whip if you have sanctions. People must take responsibility for their actions, and I think that is lacking. And it doesn't surprise that in that essay in the New York Times, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar
stay clear from that.
Yes, yes. They're actually opposed to the International Hybrid Court on Southern Sudan, and they're opting for the Justice and Reconciliation Commission, which wouldn't be a bad idea. But you get the feeling that they actually want to evade any form of accountability that international law would come with. Because what's happening is outright crimes against humanity. You have pillaging, you have ethnic targeted killings, you have rape as a weapon of war, you have civilians being killed left, right, and center in their thousands. But of course, you understand where the international community is coming from. They at the point when they needed these guys to come on a round table and pen their signatures on the agreement, you could not have indicted them and expect them to meaningfully discuss and engage. But so possibly, first get them to talk, and then
which they did and has failed.
Yeah, and has failed. International justice can later come and I think the case of Southern Sudan is more evidence, if any was ever needed, against calls for withdrawal from the ICC by African countries. Because at the end of the day, people must take responsibility for their actions. That, I think, is the only way to, one of the many maybe.
Well, of course,
to keep people in check.
We, the proponents of withdrawal from the ICC, argue that there are those we know from elsewhere that have created even worse crimes in other places and they remain scot-free.
Which is a hypocritical argument as well, because one of the cases they cite is Syria, one of the cases they cite is North Korea and all these other countries. But that
Iraq.
Those weaknesses do not
justify.
Every court system has weaknesses. The judiciary in Uganda has weaknesses. Our justice system is flawed in so many ways. That does not give
that the chicken thief should not go before court. Honor, of course, the international community is being touted here as perhaps one of the magic bullets that require to be shot to have some peace reign in South Sudan. But we know that the international community is not an altruistic group of people. It's not a communion of saints. They only come in when they have got huge interests that are under threat. South Sudan is endowed with oil, but looking at the way things are, the international community may find their oil chalice too poisoned for them to want to get in there. What other points of appetite would the international community have? Well, putting aside Uganda and IGAD, who are neighbors and all, but let's look at the big brothers as we know them. Don't we see a situation where they will possibly get them and touch them with a long stick like they've done with Somalia?
Absolutely. That's why I wanted us to return to the Uganda involvement.
You are preempting my next question, Honor. Let's start from out and
no,
then
because
I
thought we had been on Uganda,
okay,
and I thought that Uganda, look, for me, in terms of Uganda, it was a case of someone intending to take a bath and then washing the face. I think that's the mistake Uganda made. We just wash the face and assume the body is clean. So I think at the heat of the moment when Uganda went in, it really had a sort of an open door to do whatever it wanted.
That's not true. On
hold on. When everyone was not interested in going in,
exactly.
People came later to have opinion about Uganda's presence when the situation had kind of cooled. But I think when Uganda went in, it should have really gone knowing well. And if there's anybody who knows SPLA, for so many decades, it's Uganda. It's the UPDF.
I think you're making the mistake to think that Uganda is a homogeneous...
okay, but the UPDF is a homogeneous force. The force which went in.
Yeah, so when they went in there, we had our local politics at play with the opposition politicians in Uganda.
All our foreign intervention has never been with the approval of the whole country or the whole political group. It's basically a military decision. So I'm saying...
Which we knew the weaknesses. Ultra-vires. Before
we
you
knew
make
the
an
weaknesses
intervention
of
to
the
another
SPLA
country,
leadership.
You ought subject yourself to
the weaknesses
parliament.
of Machar, and we should have gone there to say, in this heat of the moment, we need to put this house in order, because one is affecting our trade, it's affecting our security, but somehow we decided to separate these fighting brothers and left everyone still threatening to box, and then we said, okay, calm down, but we did not sort out what was making them to fight. If it's indiscipline, if it was the wrong guys in charge, there was room to actually remove those guys from being in charge.
Thank you.
Put in another
now you have become the owner, I know. You, because I was going to say, knowing you possibly saying Uganda should have gone in there, fought a decisive battle, and crowned a king. Not to say, look, guys, stop fighting, and then make a decision on who takes the cake. Do you agree, Morrison?
Because in the heat of the moment,
should Uganda have gone in there, bludgeoned all these people, and then just anoint some kings and say, now you are going to reign over this, but none of them would
just my point, Uganda, there is always talk of nation building. Uganda should have gone for government building, because we know that there is no proper government, as he said. You know?
That's not to say that we are having a well-built government back home, so we're wondering why
No,
should we go.
we have one which has lasted for 30 years, so we know that it
Others
works.
will argue that its existence is also on the tenterhooks. But Morrison,
No. What I wanted to say is that, I mean, Uganda was facing a situation where in South Sudan you had a legitimate government, you know, a president who was essentially, you know, elected by South Sudanese, and then faced with what was at the time known as a renegade, you know, who was faction or coup prota. So when you are invited, you are invited by a government. You are not invited by whoever was alleged to be a coup prota. There are all those nuances that define that conflict. So Uganda was invited by a government. The Uganda government was invited by another government. So there is no way Uganda could have gone to say, you know, let's fix this government. It was, first of all, to evacuate citizens of Uganda. The objectives were very clear.
If a guy invites you and his house is on fire, does he have the power to
it was to evacuate. It was to save lives of Ugandans.
I want to ask you a very important, the objectives
What
as,
question did you
If a guy invites you and his house is on fire, he's inside the house, does he tell you what to do?
So the house was, I mean, the house was on fire, but we reached there, you know, and in a few days, the fire was put out.
Now
which laid the basis, for negotiations, which laid the basis for conversation, and all these other actors came in because lives were saved, and there was now a situation where those two protagonists could talk.
I'll turn to you, Ivan. I mean, we've been following all these, especially the snide remarks that, yes, we may turn the idea that a peaceful South Sudan is good for our trade and commerce and all. But let's be honest with ourselves. There's not much going on between Uganda and South Sudan in terms of trade. We go there to sell Rolex and ride borders, while other people who want to touch their situation with a long stick will go in there and invest in huge commercial banks and all these other big money-making things. And I'm asking myself, in the situation as it is today, what's Uganda's appetite to go to South Sudan? Never mind, of course, the South Sudanese have mistreated Ugandans, and these are stories that run in the media every other day. Those who supply them with supplies go on for months on end without pay, but incredible torture from them. What should be Uganda's motivation to go and pacify South Sudan? Why don't we let it burn to cedars, and whatever remains there possibly can sprout?
I had this discussion with Andrew Mwende a few months ago, when Uganda troops were still in southern Sudan. And he told me one time he was on NTV, I think by the Newsnight, and he was having a discussion on
I hope he declared his conflict of interest that his own blood brother was the commander of the UPDF contingent that was in there beating up that whole place. I hope he made that.
So after that Newsnight, the president called him and said, I've been watching you on your show.
Oh, really?
Come for a discussion. And the president shared with him what Andrew thinks were really convincing reasons on why he sent our troops to southern Sudan, including one, you know, the history of LRA and the role Sudan played in giving them a safe haven. So in terms of even security interests, Uganda has every reason to ensure that there's a stable southern Sudan, because enemies of Uganda, whom you cannot rule out, and which direction you cannot tell they'll come from.
A bunch of
not just LRA, because
disorganized, and they are down to their tails, not even hundreds.
What the president is coming from is, if southern Sudan is destabilized, any enemy of Uganda, it doesn't have to be LRA, will find a safe haven, and you do not know what will happen inside of the border. So Uganda has every reason to ensure that southern Sudan is stable, or at least has a semblance of stability. But of course, even the trade interests. South Sudan is one of our biggest trading partners in terms of imports and human resource. There are so many Ugandans that are making incredible fortunes from southern Sudan. People are building mansions and apartments and making their business
exports, not imports, because they don't get much from South Sudan.
In terms of southern Sudan's imports. Yeah. So even in terms of trade, Uganda has every reason to ensure that its trade partner is safe.
How about the opportunity cost? I mean, what we have got to endure in terms of human resource, in terms of our boys in uniform, the amount of money that we would require as a country to sustain them there in that theater of war, vis-a-vis what we may earn from South Sudan in terms of the trade balance sheet. Without South Sudan, don't you think
it's worth
we
it
can...
because it's worth it because you do not know how the war will rage, how long it will rage. You do not know how much the spillover effect can affect you. It can go anywhere. So, and of course, Mr. Museveni also has, at a personal level, every reason to be worried and watch his back. You do not know who might want to use Southern Sudan as a starting point to cause anarchy here.
I would have expected you to also say, Mr. Museveni, he loves to dominate the region and try to show his military muscle. Sometimes, I mean, that's what I've heard some people say, that, look, he's out there, not so much for the good that we may seem to see, but also, on the other hand, he's got his personal quest to ensure that he subjugates all these leaders around and puts them to a level where they know he's Big Daddy.
But also because he's partly sometimes a playboy of the West, who, if the West wants a stable region, there is no better ally than Mr. Museveni. So again,
and he gets leverage from them so that they don't ask the definitive governance questions
and human rights questions that need to be asked.
Let's conclude on this one here before we take a break, so that when we return, we can now discuss Uganda's domestic politics.
But the issue of Playboy, I think, is very disingenuous, because I need to say that whether it's the West, whether it is Africa, we all deserve peace.
You should say playman.
Not even a playman, because as a country, as Uganda is ideologically very clear on Pan-Africanism, on African brothers, but also living in a peaceful country and exist where also our neighbors are peaceful. So we have an existential interest, we have got a strategic interest. So it's not about playboy, it's about the peace, maintaining
but
peace.
I give all those other reasons, and the playboy is one of the other reasons.
The playboy is very disingenuous, and I think it is just part of the rhetoric that has defined some of our actors here.
Oh, now, just as a concluding one, now, which way? We are 3 days into a war that we don't even understand where it will end up or go. But of course, the human cost to it, and Ivan did start his presentation earlier on by saying his commiserations to the families. We're looking at children, women, and all these other vulnerable people that always bear the harshest brunt of a senseless war that they have no business in creating. What next for such a people? I mean, what?
Yeah, I think there is need for an international intervention again. There's no doubt about it. I don't expect that fighting to die down on its own. The employer I work for has businesses in South Sudan, and the information we have, they can't even leave now. The airport is virtually out of use. So somebody needs to reopen the airport, essential, and it cannot be a foreign force.
At least one thing you're not worried about is the consumption of your product.
Well,
I'm
people
sure
may not
it's as a result of overconsumption that we're having.
When they are in fear. Our products brings joy, and people need to socialize. You can't
or it
enjoy
insulates
when
someone
there's
against
chaos.
fear.
No.
It makes you unable to realize
the role of our product is to bring joy for people who are already happy.
In happy
increase
times.
their joy.
In happy times.
Interesting. Uganda.
So I think if it falls on Uganda, I think there's need to really intervene to save the lives and to open up the airport at most. Yeah.
It's the fourth estate, and the conversation about Sudan possibly gives us a captive, but maybe we'll return to it at some point. We're taking a short break. When we return, we'll look at the local domestic politics. Just the week we're concluding, we had a delegation from the Inter-Party Organization for Dialogue, or popularly known as IPOD, pay a visit to State House in Entebbe, where they had a conversation with President Museveni. And upon their return from that, one opposition group did disassociate themselves from what went in there, so much so that some of the politicians in that political party, I'll give details later when we return, they said they shouldn't have in the first place gone there, or if they did, they shouldn't have used their name for obvious reasons. What is the politics of the day turning to in Uganda? Have we reached a point of such intolerance that even conversations in their own right, as conversations between different political parties with the ruling party, should raise such eyebrows, accusations and counter-accusations? We'll be right back. It's the Fourth Estate. A very good evening. It's the Fourth Estate, and we're having an incredible conversation. We just had a round on South Sudan and the bloodbath that's been reported. It's taking place since Friday and going on up to now. Well, we've had reports of calm returning, but that calm is only as good as a wink in the dark. And now we're turning over to matters local, Uganda's local politics. And we know for a fact that the Inter-Party Organization for Dialogue, IPOD, which is I want to call it a loose organization of members of parliament of the different opposition parties that make it, well, it's a loose organization of members of parliament who subscribe to different political parties other than the ruling party, saying, look, we can always have a conversation between ourselves and see how best we can carry this country forward. Fast forward, there was a meeting in the State House, and I think the leader of the delegation was the Secretary General of the Democratic Party, Matthias Nsubuga. And among the many things that they discussed, at least from what I know, is that among the things they put on the table was that, one, we're in a situation where, yes, we've come from an election, but there are still many concerns coming in from that election. The observance of the respect for those who contested with you, and they were telling that President Museveni, you need not mistreat political opponents. I think it's only fair that political opponents are allowed the leeway to conduct their political business without any form of harassment. Point number two, there ought to be some electoral reforms, and very specifically, they were targeting the fact that the current electoral commission's term is coming to an end. How then can we progress to create an electoral commission that all the political players will believe in, or at least have a sense of inclusivity and all? When that conversation is done, I think amongst the things, especially to point number one of the absence of harassment, it is alleged that Matthias Nsubuga pleaded to President Museveni and said, come on, release Dr. Kizza Besigye. Dr. Besigye is angry. He's reared, or at least Ivan Okuda here can agree, because he wrote the story for the Daily Monitor. What made Besigye angry?
First, I think there's a misrepresentation. I don't know for whatever motivations, that Besigye is disappointed or angry with members of the opposition who constitute IPOD. IPOD has political parties that are represented in parliament. It currently has 4: DP, FDC, NRM, and UPC. Yes. The JEMA and CP, which were part of the old IPOD, dropped off. So it keeps being reconsidered.
CP is a one-man party.
It keeps being reconsidered after every 5 years. Besigye's contention is not with members of the opposition through IPOD engaging the president. Besigye's only point of departure is members of the opposition, specifically Matthias Nsubuga, who led that delegation, going to plead for leniency before the president. For him, Michael Kabaziruka, the MP for Nakawa, who is charged with treason and is now in Chigo prison, and other political prisoners.
Look, Ivan, the presence of political prisoners, some will argue, is as a result of political harassment of opponents. IPOD had concerns, and among them was the fact that there seems to be political harassment, or harassment in many other forms, towards people that did contest against President Museveni in many ways. How would you talk about harassment of political actors in this country without making mention of the postcard image of political harassment, who is Dr. Kizza Besigye?
Of course, Besigye wants to be president of Uganda. You do not want to be seen to be pleading for leniency for a man that you think is your oppressor. And I think Besigye has been a beneficiary of, for all the criticism of the courts of law in this country, courts that really work, because he's been acquitted of even some of the most grave offenses of rape and treason, and he's not been convicted of any offense, despite over 50 charges brought against him since 2001. So I think first, it's to say, first respect institutions, because the Nsubuga culture of pleading before Museveni, border men plead before the president, taxi men plead before the president, couples that are facing divorce plead before the president. Everybody seeks everybody seeks presidential intervention in some way. But I don't think Besigye wants to be among those
pleading
who want to reduce Uganda to a one-man state.
But also, why do I also have a feeling that you are misrepresenting the fact that Matthias Nsubuga's presentation to the president was in fact a plea?
No, it was what we read as reported by the Observer newspaper.
Was the Observer in that meeting?
It was. They don't have to have been in the meeting.
No, for you at least, you were in that meeting where Besigye was angry, and therefore we can hold you to your word. What makes us believe that the other newspaper that reported about the plea actually has it right?
But also because the Democratic Party members who were in the State House have not disowned the statements that are attributed to them in the media. But more importantly, I think the IPOD meeting with the president went beyond Kizza Besigye. Kizza Besigye came as what in law is called obiter dictum. It was just a by the way, and possibly over a cup of tea, and to say by the way, this person. But the IPOD is first. let's put in context the meeting. I had a chat with an official from IPOD before I came for the show. IPOD meeting the president is essentially to build an agenda for a national dialogue. Because the issue they had in the past is that NRM's participation and the president's participation specifically has been limited. And part of the reason is that they're not part and parcel of the agenda setting process. So they're saying, can we engage the president directly? Not as president of Uganda, but as chairman of the NRM. Because first, there is what they call the Summit of Presidents, which has not sat.
Because President Museveni
continuously is not part of those meetings.
Exactly, because of his busy schedule.
Yeah, so IPOD says, let's reach out to him. Possibly, when he's part of the agenda setting process, he has incentive to come for the next meeting.
If I get you right, I'm sorry for the interruption, Ivan. The spirit and letter of going to meet the president by IPOD is okay, at least according to what you've heard from FDC. So why was FDC conspicuously absent in that group that went to see the president?
IPOD, I mean, FDC has been an active participant of IPOD. In fact,
so much so that
Secretary General of FDC, Nandala Mafavi, is the current chairperson of IPOD.
Who should have led the delegation to State House?
Who should have led the delegation and
he didn't.
And passed the banner to Mathias Nsubuga. But he's not responsible for the opinions that Mathias Nsubuga expressed.
And now what I would want from you is why did Nanda Mafavi not to go to State
House?
There
are disagreements with, first, the setting. Because, you know, the politics of this country is structured in such a way that if you're seen going to State House, you're simply going for a photo-pocketing moment with the president, and he'll cajole you into his schemes. So I think FDC had issues with the agenda. What are you going to discuss with the man? And where do you discuss that with him from?
It sounds more to say I will not have this Euro 2016 final in France if the other team is France.
And not necessarily, but you see, I think for me, what all that brings, with due respect to IPOD and the effort that they're putting in place to foster dialogue, I think, first, is it possible to have dialogue in this country? I don't think it is.
And I ask myself now, and that now brings me to these other two gentlemen who have listened keenly to you, and I know why I left them out, because I kept in because you're privy to things. Why is it difficult for there to be dialogue, a political dialogue of that nature, as is enshrined in the spirit of IPOD? Especially so when you see that when a dialogue is mooted, then you have a party like FDC with I call them an exaggerated sense of self-worth, thinking that they will set the conditions so much so that it's either their way or no way. Nanda Mafavi, Secretary General, Chairperson of IPOD, at the last minute you back out from leading a delegation to go and have this.
You see, that was a meeting of NRM and associates. NRM, main, DP stroke NRM, UPC stroke NRM. The reason FDC possibly did not see a reason to accompany a meeting of NRM and people that associate with it.
What do you mean by UPC? Well, I mean, he makes very good, interesting inroads here. I would love to just take him on just for him to illustrate. UPC stroke NRM?
UPC stroke NRM, DP stroke NRM. You know what's happening. The president is poaching from either field, and the owners of the other garden are happy for him to come and poach from their field. And I think that is part of the reason why it's extremely difficult for you to have a conversation, because dialogue should be structured. There should be a bare minimum agenda.
So for us to have dialogue, there must be total acrimony that, I haven't reached out.
No, it should be on principle. The challenge is to go to State House and meet the president and purport to have dialogue when it's actually deal making. It's not even dialogue per se. I
thought, let's not go into the semantics of what is dialogue. Is that at the end of the day, we're trying to have some give and take, so at the end of the day, the greater good, the general shared vision of where we want to go is achieved, and that could include, and is not limited to, deal making. That's
the ideal. But the reality is, President Museveni is not willing to dialogue himself out of power. Maybe that's
actually, Simon.
That's an interesting one to come in from.
The dialogue between you and Ivan is a classic case of a dialogue, because a dialogue must be between equals, and people who really believe that they respect each other. And this current whatever took place in State House, even the president knows it's a joke. He's just having some free time, and once these guys come around, what dialogue are you talking about? The president knows very well that the equation, or the question of who leads Uganda in the next 5 years, was sorted out in the election, in the Supreme Court decision. So what dialogue? I mean,
And the
so,
military.
so really, even I don't think Ugandans out there really understand what you are talking about. What is this dialogue about? They know there was an election. Unfortunately,
No, the
they
dialogue
defeated.
owner-
Just hold on. And in this country, the history of dialogue, people know it's a joke. The biggest classic dialogue was the Nairobi peace talks. And you know what it ended up being. And even down history in the 60s, all attempts at dialogue in this country have not really worked. So either you have had elections or you have had a military intervention. So whoever went to meet the president, they know it.
But
That he
that's
doesn't even take them
That's
seriously.
against the spirit and letter of this
Well,
whole
these
thing
are
we don't
nice
like of the winner
international-
takes it all kind of
Well,
situation.
unfortunately, I'm one of the
two
opponents
major
of
points
winner
that-
take it all, but
Let's-
it's what
Oh, no,
most
but
people have gone for.
iPod went in there to say, look, we're not discussing power sharing here.
What are you
We are
discussing?
discussing the fact that, look, we have a country to govern. We have got an electoral commission whose time is coming to an end. We need to discuss modalities of how to have a new electoral commission that is all
And
inclusive.
do you
That's number
think,
one.
do you
Number
think,
two,
do you
just
think
hold on.
they, and do they think that President Museveni thinks that they have a right to decide who should be in the next electoral commission?
Yeah, now
He
that's-
doesn't believe
So
so.
what Odona
that's
is saying, the
it.
biggest stumbling block to any meaningful dialogue in this country is Morrison's boss. Because Morrison's
No,
boss,
I don't think it's
Morrison's
even
boss
Morrison's
is
boss.
not-
It's
is
the
not
reality of
ready.
the situation. He knows that the people gave him a mandate. And so he's going to do what he wishes.
Honor, his mandate
Or
is
what
not,
the
his
people
mandate
mandate
is
in
not
the
in
next
question.
5 years.
What iPod is saying is because Papa, there's a reason why the iPod constitution is such that it is parties represented in parliament, which is at the
But look,
at the
legislative
legislative
iPod
end
is
of
nothing more than,
governance.
it's more like a social club. It's not really a political decision.
Yes, but
Or-
the substance is we need to have a conversation around electoral and political reforms, which is an ongoing conversation since 2006.
Well, NRM will tell you, and maybe Morrison will say it better, that those kinds of reforms will be decided by Parliament. And who is the majority in Parliament?
Yeah,
You
no,
can guess.
I just
But I thought, well,
So
Morrison,
there's no spirit on the part of NRM to have dialogue.
well, neither is there a glaring one on the part of the FDC to subject themselves to that kind of dialogue, especially given the fact that they set conditions where it's either their way or no way.
No, it's not setting good. It is to simply say we cannot go in a dialogue about whether to ban the forest or not, and the monkey wants to chair the meeting.
That's
No,
an
no.
And to
interesting
determine the
first of all,
agenda.
they
I
are
think
not,
in this case is the old
First
monkey
of
is just
all-
the size of the monkey.
first of all, there are no monkeys in this country. They are
Figures
really
of
people.
speech.
But I need to say that the major consensus this country arrived on was in 1995, when the constitution was promulgated after discussions by elected constituent assembly leaders who were Ugandans. And the rest, I think it has been, work in progress to improve and perfect and perfect a democracy. So when you talk about the electoral reforms, we used it to line up. I think there are a number of reforms, and I think the major reform that the opposition was actually interested in is appointment of commissioners and the term and the tenure of those commissioners. Can the president, for instance, or the appointing authority, wake up one day and say, your job as a commissioner depends on whether you
My
wake up on
wings
the
and
right
fa-
side of the bed. And I think that was resolved. The president, or the appointing authority, cannot just dismiss a commissioner. And the other point that, he alluded to is that even when the president makes suggestions or recommendations for who should be appointed, the parliament, which is a multi-party parliament, must endorse whoever goes to the electoral commission. But before we cross the point I wanted to make
But the reform
on this issue of the retired Chiza Besigye being angry that
No, the
somebody
retired
did
Kano.
the retired Kano Chiza Besigye, that
That's a good.
I think that in a democracy, we should respect people's opinions even if you don't agree with them. Matthias Nsubuga, if he raised a point of view from a democratic point of view, I think, Kiza Besigye may disagree with him, but I don't think he should get angry. It was his opinion.
But why don't you also
but
respect?
Kudisi-
Why don't you also want to respect Kizza Bessigye's right to
be
get angry, even at the slightest provocation?
No, well, I think because
You have severally described him as an angry man.
Because essentially, democratic processes, mean that we agree and disagree, but we don't punch each other. We don't get angry at each other. We hold a conversation for a greater good, which greater good is about perfecting our country.
What is actually done
Transforming our country.
is to disagree and not to be angry. The word angry is
But it's you who mentioned it.
No, it's a clear push from your side to to of course, perpetuate the notion that Kizza Besigye is an angry man.
There was a headline in the Daily Monitor.
Which I don't think
a headline
is far from
in the
truth.
Daily Monitor that you work for that says Kizza Besigye angry with iPod.
And the,
It was
story,
a headline.
and the story was written by none other than him.
Yes.
And this man saw Kizza Besigye and described him from his personal observation. So, Ivan, I think it would be disingenuous on your part to claim that Kizza Besigye is not angry when you saw him angry and came and reported just as much. And now you're trying to place. But away from that, gentlemen, and as we conclude this program this evening, Honor brings out a very, I don't know how I can put it, but I think, is it defeatist in one way or... No, Honor, are you saying conversations that speak into a dialogue between folks that one would require the victor and the vanquished and all that should not be entertained in a democratic dispensation like ours? That if you lose an election at election time, you shut up, you don't try to reach out to the other person, all you have to do is now go strategize on how you can kick this one out of power after 5 years? Is that the kind of quality you want to be?
That's why I use the word the social club. It's nice for the opposition leaders to go to the president and talk, but to think that they can actually effect changes out of that discussion, you know that the president is not going to allow it because he will argue that he has consulted the NRM, he has consulted Parliament. These decisions were taken by the
President Museveni did not
he
win.
has followed the
President Museveni
constitution.
did not win with an election result of 98%, where you say, well, you can disregard the opinion of 2%. President Museveni has close to half the voters that did not vote for him. I mean, what was this percentage? 60%. What about the other 40%?
Well, I think his analysis of what happened is clear because the government is slow, government is not implementing things fast. This is what we have to sort out, not because the opposition is threatening to take power from us. I don't think the president believes that the opposition is going to take away power from him. So he is not going to discuss with them out of fear, which is important if you are to cause the other person to make a change. They must fear that you can take away their bread, so to say.
I think the point that Honor makes is that there is not yet enough pressure for meaningful dialogue between Morrison's side and the opposition side.
No, but
what would bring about that pressure? What would
but
be
the president
point?
was very clear that any time of the day, even midnight, or early in the morning, he's ready for a conversation, a honest conversation about reforms that will deepen democracy in this country.
But because, you know why?
Because he was also very clear and saying
those reforms, he knows that those reforms, even if they put in print, in our law books, will simply mean nothing but simply paper tigers.
I think that's a perception.
No, it's not a perception. Because we have
back your point of view with evidence.
We have an impressive legal regime in this country that gets violated every single hour, every single day.
But those are administrative mistakes that happen, and those ones can be
overturned
by administrative engineering.
You cannot reduce a system that operates on violation of its own laws into administrative mistakes.
A perception.
It's not a perception.
Ivan, just to try to draw the wedge in here and say, look, a political discussion of the nature that iPod is spirited around, never mind the fact that Ona thinks that discussion should be amongst people that regard themselves as equals. I think the lowest common similarity among all these parties is their interest for the betterment of Uganda, or at least that should be the case. That these are Ugandans who have participated in the political contestation to make this a better place. That alone should be an equalizer without looking into the numerical strength of who has what in parliament and all that. To say that even though you are 1 and we are 10, your 1 point could possibly be the magic bullet that the 9 of us are lacking. And I think that comes in to underscore the need for respect. Do you see the issue of respect there? And by the way, don't look at it from the side of the NRM. We also have cases where I think it works very well for the FDC to appear to be boisterous and disrespectful of the NRM, so much so that they continue to regard it as a government that stole its way into power. I
listened to your show yesterday on Capital Gang, where DP was actually complaining that, to use the MP Sewongo's word, we're oppressed by the FDC. So
that the FDC does unto other political parties exactly what it accuses the NRM of doing to it.
So, yes.
And many people left the show agreeing with the fact that, well...
But also because you almost have no position in this country. The guys that met the president meet him not because they think that will be magic bullet to having a meaningful discussion on correcting the anomalies that there are. Some of them have health issues you want to whisper to the president. Some of them...
So my prostate needs to be checked.
Some of them have...
financial issues,
issues,
worldly issues that the president normally helps you to sort out.
Exactly. So the kind of opposition that was so vibrant and viable in Kenya, forcing Daniel Arap Moi to wake up and say, yes, I think we can talk. I think I can get my way out of power peacefully and pave way for change in this country is not there. Partly because the opposition that you have is as weak as it gets.
I always would love to ask, and as we conclude this one, what makes them weak? I mean, this is his 4th consecutive time contesting against President Museveni. Dr. Kizza Besigye, what stops him from making a formidable political force in the FDC to such an extent that's regarded as an opposition?
That's a very good question. I was this afternoon reading the case of Kaonga Semogere versus Attorney General, the 2002 case in the Constitutional Court, in which Kaonga Semogere was challenging Section 18 and 19 of the Political Parties and Organizations Act, which essentially criminalized political parties in Uganda. Went ahead to establish the NRM as
a single party.
And you know, and Justice Paji Bahigain made a very good point. She said, in the law, you do not have a one-party state created, but in practice, you have a one-party state.
Simon,
for
me the issue is not the law. It's not about
it's not about the law.
This is about Uganda.
This was 2002.
No, let him finish his point.
In a second.
Give him just 5
This was
seconds.
2002. And the Constitutional Court, the justices in their wisdom, agreed with the Attorney General at the time, Ayume, that you see, yes, you're citing the law and saying the law does not create a one-party state. But what happens here is you are banning political parties from having a national conference, not more than once a year.
Electing their leaders.
You are electing the leaders and opening party branches. That was 2002. What happens now, to answer your question, why Kizza Besigye and FDC and all these other parties cannot have viable structures and be as vibrant as political parties say in Kenya or Zimbabwe or Botswana, is you have a system that deliberately disables any meaningful growth of political opposition. The system has people paid every single day to harass the opposition, to ensure that there is no growth of opposition. The constitution of NRM, one of the duties and one of the rights and duties of NRM members.
The point for me,
let Ivan conclude.
Ugandans listening out there.
It's unfair for you.
Ugandans who are listening out there, please forget, don't just heap it on the government or on the leaders. This is an issue for Ugandans. The tragedy for those who are opposing the government is that Ugandans are like soccer fans. They will support the team, and when it loses, it's a bad day, and they go home. So these opposition leaders, unfortunately, are always being abandoned by their fans at their hour of need. Let me tell you, look, there is no system, there is no government which will suppress a people who are determined. But when people are comfortable enough, so to say, not to challenge,
I think
then how can you?
I think
before you come in, Morrison, I didn't use the same football analogy. If I may add in my 2 pence, I think beyond the fans going back home after a bad day on the pitch, I think even the football team in itself, before the next game, abandons training and goes in to do fishmongering and other things, and only wake up the night before to try and do some ad hoc training, as we've seen the case with the FDC, where for the most part of the 5 years when they are out of power, spend much of time roughshod over the streets and demonstrating, and then only remember to put themselves together 2 years before the next
election.
Just
a second.
Well,
first of all, I think Ona makes a very interesting point, and I think Okuda made a lot of, sweeping, grandstanding points. If you look clearly at the FDC, you realize that they have a ideological, whether it's ideological confrontation within the political party, where you have one group that is pursuing activism. And activism is not organizing, they are activists. And then there's another group, I think of Muchamuntu.
You're meaning the radical group and the sensible group.
Yeah, no, I didn't say that. But which wanted to focus on building structures, and nobody stopped them. They had started. But there's another group that said the pursuit of power must be, hold the horns, fight on the streets, and pursue belligerence over-organizing. And that's the crisis.
But it's healthy for FDC to have those disagreements. I mean, the NRM.
Nobody's saying
NRM,
Kasule Lumumba, but you say the political parties can't organize.
No,
but they don't want their agenda is not organized. It is the street.
Morrison and Ivan, we get your points of variance. But be that as it may, for every good conversation, even if it were a good dance, at one point you get off the stage. Unfortunately, we have to leave it at this and say it was nice having this conversation with you. Pardon to you who had lined up your questions or comments for our phone lines that was not able to take place for technical reasons, but I believe that the conversation has been not just animated and entertaining, but has been insightful and educative for all of you. It's been a pleasure hosting this program, and I can't wait to be back here another time in the absence of Charles. It's been an incredible moment for you to join us here on Apito, Morrison, and you, Ivan Okuda. Have a wonderful night. Stay tuned to NTV. Our quality programming goes on even beyond these incredible programs. Good evening.